Beaver Creek Mainline, Caribou Country, British Columbia Interior. Last week of March, 1962, 6:40 in the morning. Wilf Daniluk, 38, 11 seasons hauling logs for a Quesnel area mill operation, brought his Hayes HD down off the camp loading deck with 58 tons of green lodgepole pine on the bunks, and stopped the truck cold at the cattle guard 4 miles past the gate. He did not put it back in gear. He climbed down, walked 20 feet along the running surface in his caulk boots, and pushed his heel into the shoulder where the ditch line met the road crown. It sank to the ankle. Water followed the print back out. He walked back to the cab and got the camp foreman on the radio. 4 words. She's gone at 4. Not the whole 30 miles of mainline. 4 miles in, where the subgrade had always been clay under a thin cap of pit-run gravel, and where 11 Caribou Springs had taught Wilf Daniluk that this exact stretch went before anything else on the road did. The rest of the main line might carry a loaded truck for another week. This 4 miles would not carry one more truck that morning, let alone the 11 queued behind him at the landing, with a full day's cut waiting to move. The company's road manual rated the main line for 60 tons, year-round. It said nothing about a boot heel in a ditch line at 6:40 on the last Tuesday of March. What Wilf Daniluk knew, standing in that ditch with his own weight sinking half an inch further with every second, was worth more that morning than anything written in the manual, because the manual did not know the road was going. He did, and he had just shut down the season. The truck Wilf Daniluk backed away from that ditch was not a general-purpose highway vehicle adapted for logging work. Hayes Manufacturing, the Vancouver company that built it, had spent 4 decades designing trucks specifically for Pacific Northwest logging conditions. Grades, loads, and road surfaces, no standard commercial chassis was engineered to survive. The high-tensile steel frame was built to carry a bunkload of green timber without twisting under torsion on an uneven mainline surface. The tandem rear axle spread 60 tons of load across a wider footprint than a single axle could manage, which mattered on a road with no engineered base to speak of. What the frame and the tandem axle could not do was tell Wilf Daniluk whether the ground underneath that footprint was still frozen or had already turned to clay soup 4 inches down. That was not an engineering problem. Hayes built the truck to carry the load the road could bear. It could not measure what the road could bear on any given morning in March. The truck's engineering answered a question the BC Interior had been asking since the first hand-built mainlines went in. How do you move 60 tons of timber through country with no highway? It never answered the other question. When does the road stop being able to answer that question honestly? That answer lived in a boot heel, not in a frame rating. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian logging truck culture from 1920 to 1980. What the truck was, what the road required, and what the driver who ran the same 30 miles through 11 Springs knew about the exact point a mainline stopped carrying weight, something no Hayes Manufacturing frame rating and no company road manual had ever needed to record. Not spectacle, the documented mechanical and operational intelligence of an industry that shut itself down every spring on the word of men who could read a ditch line with their boots. A Hayes HD sat idle in camp for 6 weeks every spring, not because anyone wanted the rest, but because 30 miles of thawing clay could not carry 60 tons until the ground itself decided otherwise, and no engine, no brake, and no driver's judgment could talk it into carrying that weight early. And if your family ran a mainline through breakup, put it in the comments. What was the sign, before the district ever posted a closure, that told the driver the road was about to go? A future video follows the road crews who fought to keep certain BC mainlines open through breakup with ditching, corduroy, and gravel, and what that work cost them. Back on the mainline, To understand why 4 miles of the Beaver Creek main line went before the rest, you need to understand what a logging main line actually was underneath. It was not built the way a provincial highway was built. Company road crews cleared a right-of-way through caribou timber, cut a subgrade out of whatever soil sat under the trees, and capped it with pit-run gravel where gravel was available, and with whatever else was at hand where it wasn't. On the Beaver Creek main line, 4 miles in, the crew that built the road in the late 1940s had cut through a clay seam and had not had the gravel to cap it properly before winter closed the season that year. Clay-based subgrade behaves in a specific way every spring. Through winter, the ground freezes from the surface down, sometimes several feet deep in a hard caribou winter. When the air warms in March, the top of that frozen column thaws first, but the frozen ground underneath does not let the meltwater drain away. It has nowhere to go but up into the layer of soil that has just thawed. A road surface that looked solid on Monday could be saturated clay by Thursday because the thaw was working from the surface down while the frozen barrier below held the water in. Gravel-capped sections drained better and held longer. Bare clay sections, like the 4 miles past the cattle guard, went first, every year, for as long as Wilf Daniluk had driven the road. BC Forest Service Road standards of the period addressed this in a general way. Weight restrictions during seasonal breakup, tied to road and weather conditions rather than a fixed calendar date, because the date the ground gave out could shift 2 or 3 weeks from one spring to the next. What the standard could not do was tell a driver on a specific Tuesday morning whether this was the year it broke early or late. That call was made at ground level, one boot heel at a time. Spring breakup was not an inconvenience logging operations tolerated. It was a known, annual, unavoidable constraint that the entire production calendar was built around, the way a farm's calendar is built around a growing season. A caribou interior operation running Hayes and Pacific trucks on company main lines through the 1950s and 1960s planned its heaviest hauling for winter year and a late fall, when the frozen subgrade could carry a full load without damage, and treated the 6 to 8 week breakup window as dead time for loaded trucks. Not dead time for the operation as a whole, but a period when the mainline itself set the schedule rather than the mill's order book. During that window, a loaded truck on a softened mainline did not simply risk getting stuck. It risked destroying the subgrade permanently, grinding ruts down into the clay that no amount of later grading would fully repair, turning a road that might carry trucks again in 3 weeks into a road that needed rebuilding. That cost, multiplied across 30 miles of company mainline and however many branch roads fed into it, was the reason operations enforced the shutdown themselves, even where no government inspector was checking. A ruined road cost more in June than an idle truck cost in April. For a camp like the one Wilf Daniluk worked out of, this meant 6 to 8 weeks where the falling and bucking crews kept cutting, the landing kept stacking logs that had nowhere to go yet, and the truck sat in the yard while the company waited for the ground to decide it was done thawing. The mill in Quesnel adjusted its intake schedule around a gap in supply that happened every single year. Never a surprise. Only ever a question of exactly which week. None of this. The clay seam, the frost mechanics, the company's general weight restriction policy, told Wilf Daniluk the road was gone at 4 miles on that specific Tuesday morning. 11 springs on the same 30 miles of mainline had taught him something the policy could not: which specific stretches went first, in what order, and what the ground felt like in the last hour before it gave out completely. He knew the 4-mile stretch went before the 9-mile stretch, even though the 9-mile stretch looked wetter, because the 9-mile section had a gravel cap the 4-mile section never got. He knew a morning with overnight cloud cover meant the road held an extra day, because cloud cover kept the ground from freezing hard the night before, which meant less meltwater arrived all at once the next afternoon. He knew the specific sound the truck's tandem axle made on ground that was about to let go. Not a sound anyone had described to him, but one he recognized the third time he heard it, and never again mistook for anything else. None of this had been written down anywhere Wilf Daniluk knew of. He had not been taught the 4-mile stretch by anyone. He had learned it by driving past the point where he should have turned back, early in his second season, and getting a loaded truck stuck to the frame in soup that had looked, from the cab, exactly like solid road. He had walked out for help that day and gone back for the truck 2 days later. Once the ground had firmed, he never again trusted what the road looked like from the cab in the last 2 weeks of March. He got out and tested it with his boot every single time, at every point along the 30 miles where he had once been wrong. Breakup did not only stop the trucks, it stopped the entire chain the trucks connected. At the landing, the loader operators kept building decks of logs that had nowhere to go. Caribou mills needed timber delivered close to when it was cut, both to manage yard space and because green logs left too long lost value to checking and insect damage. A camp running at full production through winter could accumulate 6 to 8 weeks of uncut inventory sitting at roadside landings with no way to move it, which meant the falling crews eventually slowed too, once the landings filled past what the camp had room to stack. The cookhouse and bunkhouse population of a caribou logging camp did not usually shrink much during breakup. Most crews stayed on, doing road maintenance, equipment overhaul, and whatever falling the landings could still absorb. But the rhythm of the camp changed completely. The 4:15 wake-up for the haul crew, the engine noise before dawn, the trucks queued at the landing, all of it went quiet for 6 weeks, replaced by mechanics working on engines that would sit unused until the ground firmed, and road crews doing what maintenance they could on sections still passable on foot or with light equipment. For the log truck driver specifically, breakup was the one period of the year when 11 years of specialized road knowledge had no application at all. Wilf Daniluk spent the 6 weeks of the 1962 breakup doing brake jobs and frame inspections on the Hayes HD in the camp shop. Necessary work, but work any competent mechanic in camp could equally have done. The knowledge that made him valuable on the main line in October meant nothing in April until the ground gave its answer and the trucks rolled again. Before you can understand why an entire caribou logging operation would idle its most expensive equipment for 6 weeks rather than risk 4 miles of mainline, you need to understand what a rebuilt road actually cost a mid-century BC logging company. A subgrade ground into ruts by loaded trucks during breakup did not simply need grading. In clay country, it often needed rebuilding from the subgrade up. New material hauled in, the roadbed reshaped, drainage recut. Work that could take a road crew weeks, and that competed directly with every other maintenance job the company had queued for summer. Every BC interior operation, running mainline haul trucks through this period, understood the same arithmetic. A truck sitting idle for 6 weeks cost the company 6 weeks of that truck's productivity. A ruined road cost the company that same truck's productivity for the rest of the season, on top of the rebuilding cost, on top of every other truck depending on the same stretch of mainline to reach the mill. This is why breakup was treated industry-wide as a fixed, non-negotiable feature of the operating year, rather than a problem to be worked around with better trucks or braver drivers. No engineering improvement to the Hayes HD, no frame strengthening, no tire selection, no braking system, changed the fact that thawing clay under a loaded truck's tires would fail regardless of how well built the truck was. The constraint sat in the ground, not the machine. Every operation running BC interior mainlines in the 1950s and 1960s built its annual production plan around a 6 to 8 week gap that the ground itself scheduled, one that no amount of company urgency could move up by even a week. The specific vulnerability of the Beaver Creek Mainline's 4-mile clay stretch did not last as a company priority forever. Through the later 1960s, as BC interior operations invested in better road-building material and drainage standards, the main line was recapped with a deeper gravel base and a ditch system engineered to carry meltwater away from the subgrade rather than letting it pull underneath. The recapping did not eliminate breakup as an industry-wide constraint. The ground still froze and still thawed every spring, and main lines across the Caribou still shut down for weeks every year into the 1970s and beyond. What it eliminated was the specific 4-mile stretch that had gone first every year for as long as anyone in camp could remember. What the improved road removed, along with the ruts, was the specific reason Wilf Danyluk needed to know that stretch better than anyone else on the crew. A driver who joined the operation in 1968 and drove the recapped Beaver Creek main line never needed to learn what the ground under the 4-mile stretch felt like in the last week of March, because the ground under that stretch no longer behaved any differently from the rest of the 30 miles. The specific knowledge, which stretch, in what order, by what sound in the axle, had no road left to apply itself to. It was not replaced. It became unnecessary, the way a skill becomes unnecessary when the specific problem it solved gets engineered out of existence, rather than solved by the person who understood it best. Wilf Danyluk drove the Beaver Creek main line for 6 more seasons after the 1968 recapping. He still walked out to test questionable ground before trusting it with a loaded truck. Old habits did not disappear because one 4-mile stretch stopped needing them. But he later told the camp foreman that the recapped road was, in his word, easier. He retired from hauling in 1974, the year before Hayes Manufacturing itself closed its doors in Vancouver. What did not survive Wilf Danyluk's retirement was not a single trick or a single stretch of road. It was a working model of 30 miles of mainline across 11 full seasonal cycles. The order-specific sections gave out each spring. The sound a tandem axle made on ground about to fail. The 2 extra days a cloudy night bought a driver in late March. None of it had been written into any BC Forest Service road standard because none of it needed to be. It lived in one man's boots and one man's ears, and it left the operation the day he did. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these trucks and in the men who drove them, subscribe. There are more main lines, more breakup mornings, more boot heel decisions that lived in drivers' bodies for a decade and were never written down. A Hayes HD sat idle in camp for 6 weeks every spring, not because anyone wanted the rest, but because 30 miles of thawing clay could not carry 60 tons until the ground itself decided otherwise, and no engine, no brake, and no driver's judgment could talk it into carrying that weight early. And if you have a memory of a main line, a breakup season, a camp that waited out the mud, now put it in the comments. What was the sign before anyone official called it that told your family the road had gone? A future video follows the road crews who fought to keep certain BC main lines open through breakup with ditching, corduroy, and gravel, and what that work cost them. The Beaver Creek main line was recapped with a deeper gravel base and a proper ditch system in 1968. The 4-mile clay stretch was rebuilt from the subgrade up. What the improved road gave the operation: a shorter, more predictable breakup, less rutting, no more boot heel test at the cattle guard 4 miles past the gate. What the improved road removed: the need to know what that specific stretch of clay did to itself every March in the last hour before it gave out. Wilf Danyluk drove the improved mainline for 6 years before he retired in 1974. He said it was easier. He did not say what he meant by that.